Our first keynote speaker this afternoon is Michael O'Neill, known around the world as the Miracle Hunter. He's an award-winning author, EWTN radio and television host, and creator of themiraclehunter.com. Michael has documented more than 2,500 Marian apparitions, investigated Eucharistic miracles worldwide, and is widely recognized as the foremost English-speaking authority on miracles in the church. I'm pretty sure he's going to speak English today. You may have seen his expertise featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, and on EWTN programs like The Miracle Hunter, They Might Be Saints, and Explore with the Miracle Hunter. Today he will lead us in his keynote, Miracles and Saints, Signs of Hope for Pilgrims Today, showing how God's power through the saints continues to inspire us as pilgrims of hope. Let's welcome Michael O'Neill.
When I was young, I had a very specific favorite month of the year. And to be fair, maybe it's more 30 days than a true month. But it ranged from Jesus' birthday on December 25th to my birthday on January 25th. And every year I looked forward to that span of days. And I'm a Chicago guy, so looking forward to the winter is kind of strange. But maybe it was because of all the presents, birthday presents, Christmas presents. Maybe it was all the sweets and treats. Maybe it was time with family and friends. And maybe it was because we didn't have to go to school during that time. But these days, many years later, Jesus' birthday is still great, but I don't look forward to my own birthday quite as much. And I'm actually coming up on a big round number this January. Not looking forward to it, but it's happening. Nothing I can do about it. But when I think about birthdays, I think of a really big birthday that's going to be happening in the world in a few years. In 2033, we have the 2000th birthday of our Catholic Church. It's a big one. There's going to be jubilees and celebrations and speeches and appearances by the Pope, indulgences, the whole deal. Everybody, Christians worldwide, are going to join hands and celebrate this one. And everybody's going to love it. And they're going to say, wow, 2000, isn't that amazing? Except for the people who say, wow, 2000, that's a big number. Are we still putting our faith in this ancient religion? This dusty old book? Is that really where our faith is based on? When is Jesus coming anyway? There's going to be people who say that. And people who don't believe. And people who say, I'd rather put my faith in science. Well, my name is Michael O'Neill. I'm the Miracle Hunter. I travel the world looking for miracles and documenting them in my books and radio and television series. And I'm here to tell you today that, actually, science can show that some miracles do happen. Specifically, Eucharistic miracles. So today I'm going to be talking about science and miracles. We're going to review Catholic belief in the Eucharist. We're going to go over the history of Eucharistic miracles. We'll talk about the types of Eucharistic miracles. We'll look at some case studies. I'm actually doing a new television series with EWTN called Miracles of the Eucharist and releasing a brand new book by that same title. But I've been able to travel the world to the 5 most highly tested and proved cases of Eucharistic miracles. We're talking about Lanciano in Italy, Buenos Aires in Argentina, Tixtla in Mexico, and Sokółka and Legnica in Poland. I'm going to go over those examples today and tell you what I discovered in my travels. And then at the end, we're going to try to answer that very difficult question of why Eucharistic miracles? Already, the Eucharist is the greatest miracle that we have in our Catholic Church. Why do we need a miracle on top of a miracle? So I'll do my best to answer that one in a little bit. So let's look at science and the miraculous. So when we talk about the miracles that the Catholic Church looks at. We talk about medical healing, such as those at Lourdes and at canonization causes. We talk about those weeping statues of Mary, the apparitions of Mary and the saints, stigmata, those people who bear the wounds of Christ, incorruptible saints, those saints whose bodies are in a state of near perfect preservation, and Eucharistic miracles. And when we talk about healing miracles, we're referring specifically to the Lambertini criteria. This is a picture of Prospero Lambertini. He's an Italian cardinal who went on to become Pope Benedict XIV. He was born in the 1600s, and he came up with the entire rule book of how the church looks at healing miracles and incorruptible bodies and other things as well. His rule book is still in use today in the Catholic Church. We don't update our stuff too often as Catholics, but we know it's a traditional way to look at it. It's a classic way. So what did Prospero say? He said the disease must be serious and impossible to cure. Not a cold that's a little bit stronger than usual, that goes away faster than usual. And not in a stage liable to go on its own. It must be spontaneous, complete, meaning if you're blind in two eyes, if only one eye comes back, that doesn't count. It must be permanent. There can be no medical treatment that relates to the cure. Of course, the church wants us to see our doctors, but in those cases where medicine or surgery does the trick, the church will never say, that was God doing it. No, God was working through the hands of a good surgeon. But they'll never use it for a canonization of a saint. And then there's weeping icons. We talk about in Greece, we talk about in Russia, in countries all around the world, there have been these weeping statues and icons of Mary. Here, pictured here, is a bronze statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe from Our Lady of Guadalupe Parish in Hobbs, New Mexico. This was featured in the Washington Post because on 4 different occasions she was found to weep tears. And this was captured on iPhones and posted on YouTube for all the world to see. And Bishop Oscar Cantu from Las Cruces, New Mexico, he said that this was inexplicable and therefore a miracle. I was curious about this one. I actually traveled to Mexico and I went to the foundry that made this statue and I talked to the sculptor and all the people who worked there, and they said, well, we've made many statues of Our Lady of Guadalupe, hundreds or thousands of them over the years, and this is the only one that weeps. And they said, we call her La Milagrosa, the miracle worker. And so this happens even in America. And so we get excited about these things because we can x-ray the statues and find that there's no internal ductwork. We can check the pipes. We can check the video surveillance to make sure that people aren't sneaking in the middle of the night with eyedroppers. We can check to make sure pig's fat isn't put on the eyes so that when rain hits it, it turns to blood. We can test all these things. But what's very interesting is that not all weeping statues are the same. Sometimes Mary cries with tears of blood. Sometimes tears of myrrh or oil. Sometimes human tears. Sometimes tears of water. Sometimes the tears come from one eye, sometimes both. Why is it so different in all these cases? And what are we supposed to do with a weeping statue anyway? There are no messages associated. So all miracles are a little bit complicated. And then we talk about visions of Mary. Pictured here are the alleged visionaries of Medjugorje, hooked up to brain scanners. So in those places in the world where they know Marian apparitions are going to happen, and of course that's not something that we usually know when it's going to happen, but at Medjugorje they've known those days and times, so they've hooked people up to brain scanners. And they've done psychological testing to make sure the visionaries aren't crazy. This is the way the church uses testing to figure this out. But in essence, it all relates to them being good witnesses. The church looks at its criteria for evaluating somebody psychologically and making sure they're good witnesses. That's how they apply science in this case. And then there's stigmata. Pictured here is one of my favorite saints, the great miracle worker, Padre Pio, the Capuchin friar who for 50 years exhibited the wounds of Christ known as the stigmata. And his hands bled profusely. And we might say, can't we just all show our Protestant friends the stigmatics and say, check these guys out, isn't this amazing? No Protestants have the stigmata. Wouldn't that convert a few people? Well, maybe. But it turns out that all miracles are a little bit complicated. So when we talk about stigmata, we could say that Padre Pio has his wounds in the hands, The Shroud of Turin, for example, has the wounds in the wrists and other stigmatics in the wrists. St. Francis of Assisi had these three-dimensional nail marks coming from his hands. Some saints have them in their hands, some in their sides, some in their feet, some in their forehead. Priest Newman of Germany has 60 lash marks on her back. And so why the difference? All miracles are a little bit complicated. It would be great if all the wounds were exactly the same. So how does this work anyway? Well, it's a question for God when we get to heaven, but maybe it's something like God blesses or curses the mystic by meeting them halfway. So the mystic might have an understanding of Christ's passion through either artwork or their own personal reflections on the Gospels, and then they have an idea of how the wounds of Christ were, and God gives them this gift. And therefore, that's why it shows up in those locations only. We don't really know. It's a question for God when we get to heaven. And then there are the incorruptible saints. This is a remarkable phenomenon. We talk about these saints who are in a near state of perfect preservation in countries all around the world. And we don't see, well, to be fair, Catholics are the only ones who dig up the relics of their I was going to say we don't see a lot of Protestant incorruptibles, but they leave their bones alone. But does anyone in the audience know how many saints there are in Catholic Church history, approximately? 10,000. 10,000, I heard that number. That is correct. Approximately 10,000. Now, does anyone know how many incorruptible saints there are? 100. So, anybody who's good at math can move those zeros around. That's a small number, a small percentage. So why the small number? And then also we might say, well, some of these saints like St. Bernadette are perfectly incorrupt. And then other saints are partially incorrupt. Like they might have an incorrupt heart, or an incorrupt finger, or an incorrupt throat. And then we have to come up with all these funny Catholic explanations, like, well, he was a great lover of God, so his heart was incorrupt. Or he gave great homilies, so his throat, his tongue was incorrupt. Or she pointed the way to heaven, that's why her finger's incorrupt. Well, and then there are saints who are incorrupt for a couple of decades, and other saints, like Saint Charbel, who are incorrupt for centuries. And we might say, why the difference? It's another question for God when we get to heaven. And to be fair, nobody should ever start a sentence with the phrase, if I were God. But, if I were God, and I was going to invent a concept like incorruptibility, I would make sure that the saints were incorrupt from head to toe, so we wouldn't have to make up these funny things about their body part meaning anything. And I'd also make sure that they were incorrupt for all time, so all the Christian faithful could see. And then I'd also make only the saints incorrupt and the non-saints corrupt, so we would know who was who. But I'm not God, and I didn't come up with this thing, so it's another question for God when we get to heaven. So let's just review Catholic belief in the Eucharist. And when we talk about the complications of miracles, one of the reasons I point out all those other interesting things is because they're all fascinating. They all embolden our faith in some way. But the miracles of the Eucharist are the ones where we can say science can actually prove them. And so let's talk about Catholic belief in the Eucharist. So when it comes to the Eucharist, we're all kind of doubting Thomases at one time or another in our lives, aren't we? It's the most difficult and uncomfortable of Catholic doctrines. God humbles himself to make himself into a piece of bread that can be desecrated, ignored, forgotten. Why does this happen? How is this possible? We're all doubting Thomases. And all those Pew Research studies show that even when you ask Catholics who believes in the Eucharist, it's something like 33%. Some years they have higher numbers than others, and with the Eucharistic revival, those numbers are going up. But imagine this, you're sitting in Mass on Sunday. If you look to your left and you look to your right, only one of the three of you believes in the real presence. That's a problem, because this is the greatest miracle we have and the greatest gift that God has given us. We have to be a little bit like King Louis IX of France, the saintly king of France. There's a story where King Louis is working in his study, and his assistant comes running to him. King, come to your chapel immediately. I'm busy. I'm not coming to the chapel. King, there's a Eucharistic miracle happening in your chapel. You need to see it. King Louis says, no thanks. And then his courier says, I don't know if you know this, but there's a bleeding Eucharist in your very chapel. You need to see this. And the king looks up and says to him, I wouldn't believe more fully in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, even if it was here in my own chapel. Thank you for letting me know. And he went back to work. So these Eucharistic miracles are amazing, but we really need to have belief in the real presence. And a little bit of Catholic history, we talk about St. Thomas Aquinas, who came up with the idea of transubstantiation, or he elucidated it. He said that the bread and wine changes in substance to the body, blood, soul, into divinity. He called this transubstantiation. The appearance, or known as accidents, remain. The look, the taste, the molecular structure, the ability to contract bread mold still remains. Now, when we talk about the Bible and the Eucharist, I know we're all Catholics here, so your Bibles might be dusty, but when you get home, I'd like you to dust off your Bible from your nightstand or wherever it's hiding, and open it up to John 6. And when we talk about the Eucharist in the Bible, we always talk about the Last Supper, the big moment, right? Everybody always says Eucharist, Last Supper, but it's my contention that John 6 is the most important part of the Bible when it comes to the Eucharist. Jesus says, and when he says truly, truly, he means trust me, I mean it. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. So I should point out that in the entire Gospels, there is only one place where Jesus loses followers, where people turn their back on Jesus and walk away. That is John 6, where he's speaking to the crowds about the bread of life. Now, we might say, well, didn't Jesus speak in metaphors and parables, especially in the Gospel of John? Jesus says, I am the gate. Well, did anybody in the crowd who heard Jesus say, I am the gate, think that he was brown and made of wood and have a handle and hinges? Did anybody think that and say, forget this guy, I'm leaving? Nope. Everybody in the crowd said, no, that's a pretty good metaphor. Open the door, you get through Jesus, you go to the Father. That makes sense, good metaphor. Jesus also says in John, I am the true vine. Did anybody think that Jesus was saying that he was green and mossy? And did anybody leave when he said that and said, this guy's crazy? Nope. Everybody said, no, that's a good metaphor, I'll go with that one. And they were fine with it. But in John 6, verse 51, Jesus claims to be living bread that followers must eat. The bread which I shall give is my flesh. When he's saying these things, the crowds are dispersing. And the Jews were disputing amongst themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? And Jesus asked, do you take offense at this? Clearly Jesus saw that the crowds were leaving, that people were bothered, people were murmuring. So he says out loud, addresses the crowd, do you have a problem with what I'm saying? In verse 52, Jesus more emphatically, truly, truly, again, I'm serious here. Truly, truly, I say unto you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. In this moment, Jesus could have said, they're not getting it. This is not a good metaphor. This is not a good story. Nobody quite understands what I'm saying. He could have said, just ignore the last thing I said, I'll try something else. But instead he says, truly, truly, and repeats it, and more people leave. And we might all have this idea, or people might have this idea that when Jesus was saying, you must have me inside of you, my life inside of you, he might be saying something in the heart, something internal, something metaphorical. But if you look at the Greek words for eating, phago, the actual word is trogo, to chew on or to gnaw on. So Jesus is so literal when he says, you must chew on my flesh. You must gnaw on my flesh. It is not this sort of nice idea that we might, Protestants might say that Jesus means by this, something metaphorical. So in verse 57, Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, will you also go away? And Peter famously says, Lord, to whom will we go? And that's what our response needs to be. But what I think is so important here is that there is no doubt that Jesus is in fact saying that his flesh is true flesh that must be eaten. So this is quite a remarkable claim by Jesus. And of course, at the Last Supper, Jesus says, do this in memory of me. So let's go through the brief history of Eucharistic miracles. Throughout Christian history, there have been a little over 100 Eucharistic miracles around the world, starting in Egypt in the year 400. The most recent was in Legnica in Poland in 2013. But I must say that almost on a monthly basis, I get messages to my email inbox from all around the world saying, we think we have a Eucharistic miracle. So, some of them may be true, some of them may be false. But these things are happening all around the world, including a recent one in Los Angeles. So we'll see what happens there. It's happened in 20 countries around the world, 90% European, Italy, Spain, and France. And since 1900, 70% have happened outside of Europe. And only one case in North America in 2006 in Tixtla in Mexico. Here's a map that I created of all the Eucharistic miracles of the world. You can see they're heavily concentrated in Europe. Here's a zoom in on Europe. And if we look at by centuries, the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries are where we see the most Eucharistic miracle claims. I'm an engineer in a former life, so you'll see a lot of charts and graphs here today. I hope you're okay with that. So, types of Eucharistic miracles. We have the experiences of saints, the preservations from danger, images on the host, multiplication of bread, and flesh and blood cases, which to me are the most compelling. So here is Blessed Alexandrina from Portugal. She had inedia, which is a phenomenon where she survived on one Eucharistic host each and every day of her life. Truly amazing. St. Thomas Aquinas had visions of the Eucharist. St. Stanislaus Kostka had a mystical communion experience as well. So various saints throughout history have had Eucharistic miracle experiences. And then we have preservation from danger. Like in Siena in Italy, I was just there in August. I was able to see these hosts for myself. Thieves stole hosts from the ciborium, and they were returned to the church eventually. And that procession back to the church is where we have the Corpus Christi procession coming from. But those hosts from the 1700s are still scientifically validated as perfectly preserved. The fire in Turin in 1640, there was a fire that consumed an entire church, but the tabernacle melted in a bubble, protective bubble around the Eucharist. There was a flood in Pinocchio in Italy in 1630 that parted ways as well. Everything in the church was destroyed, except for parting right around the Eucharist. So we have many stories like this all around the world. And then we have images found on the host or on the altar cloth. In Waldern in Germany, Father Otto spilled communion wine, and he had 11 images of the crucified Christ on his altar cloth. In Tratakanam in Villucanur in India, there's a face of Jesus that appeared supposedly on the host. And in this 2013 case, this was actually validated by the Vatican as inexplicable and worthy of belief. And then here's one that maybe you've heard of here, in Thomaston, Connecticut, in 2023. I remember this day very clearly because I got all kinds of emails to my email inbox that day, and maybe some of you in this audience emailed me, because on that day, we see at St. Thomas Church on March 5th, Father Joseph Crawley, one of the people distributing communion, found the wafers actually duplicated, multiplied in his ciborium. And it was investigated by the Diocese of Hartford and was sent to the Vatican's DDF with no decision having been rendered. So, a lot of people in this audience are probably wondering, was that truly a Eucharistic miracle? Well, they had a camera on it at the time. Unfortunately, there was a Eucharistic prayer that was printed on top of the video, so they don't really know. They've done some scientific testing, and there has been a claim that's made that the hosts of one were different weight than the hosts of the other. In either case, unfortunately, we will not see either the diocese or the Vatican commenting on this. This is one of these cases that you have to bring your own belief to the table. And nothing stands in the way of you doing that. But this is one of these cases where we see the Vatican not proceeding in this further investigation. And then there are cases like Santarém in Portugal. And this is right outside of Fatima, 30 minutes away. And what's interesting about this Eucharistic miracle is that if you go, if you know the little secret, if you know the trick, if you bring a donation for the church and you give it to the parish priest, they'll open up the secret door. So there's a secret door behind the altar, and you get to climb up a ladder, and you can get up to 1 foot away from this Eucharistic miracle. And the story goes that there was a woman who was upset at her unfaithful husband, so she consulted a sorcerer. And the sorcerer said, "Bring me a consecrated Eucharistic host." So according to the story, the woman went to Mass and received on her tongue, but as she snuck out of church, she put it in a handkerchief, and she carried it home. She brought it home and waited in her bedroom for her husband, and hid the host inside the dresser to give to the witch the next day. And then the husband came home, and it began to illuminate with light, and they opened up the drawer, and it was bleeding with blood. And the priest came back to that church and took it back in a procession as well. And they tested this sample, and it turned out to be blood type AB in modern times. And it is still on display for people to see, even today. Now let's look at some case studies of Eucharistic miracles. As I mentioned before, I'm working on a new EWTN documentary in which I'm presenting all the most famous cases of Eucharistic miracles. So where possible, I interviewed witnesses, the scientists, and the priests who are there at the time of these miracles. The earliest one is in Lanciano in Italy. So when we talk about investigating Eucharistic miracles, then inquiry is begun by the local bishop. The chain of custody must be established. They need to know who had the host, where was the host at all times. A sample is sent to an independent lab, meaning that it's always sent to a non-Catholic place where possible. No disclosure of the source, and they always come back with the human origin, blood muscle tissue type. And they always like to say, where did the blood come from? Was it inside the host or outside the host? If it's outside the host, perhaps it could have been wiped on the host in a hose. But if it comes from inside the host, we know that it's emanating from somewhere else. And they give a yes or no answer. Is this truly a miracle? So again, the local bishop is the one to investigate. If the Vatican encourages the devotion, they will give a nihil obstat statement, and it may be recognized by the Vatican. So again, the 5 most studied cases, and within the past year, I traveled to all these places around the world. Lanciano in Italy, Buenos Aires in Argentina, Tixtla in Mexico, Sokółka, and Legnica in Poland. So that was just a short clip from the Lanciano episode. Lanciano is on the east coast of the Italian route. And that's something from the mid-8th century, where a priest with serious doubts had this experience where in his hands, the host changed into true flesh. And you can go there today and actually see this ring of flesh. Up close, you can get up within a couple of feet of this ring of flesh. They also have the globules of blood still saved from the 8th century. Scientific testing has showed that this is truly human flesh, truly human blood of blood type AB. And so this is one of the earliest studied cases of Eucharistic miracles. And then Buenos Aires in Argentina in 1996. I don't know if you've ever flown down to South America, but it's a long flight from Chicago to Buenos Aires. Something like 14 hours ultimately. So that was the Eucharistic miracle of Buenos Aires, another episode on EWTN. And this case was investigated by Bishop Jorge Bergoglio, who you know as Pope Francis. And so in 1996, there was a discarded host that was found and put in water, as is the common practice, called to be drained down to the earth in a sacrarium. That's the standard practice. They reserved it in water for 3 years, and after that, they found this sample had blood, or what they looked to be blood or muscle, in that water. And then it was investigated by scientists in San Francisco, and then in New York. And it was truly amazing, the results. So it was 1999 is when they first investigated this. Now they've given me some photos. This is from the shrine there in Buenos Aires, where these are the high-resolution photos that were sent to me of the Eucharist. So Dr. Ricardo Castañón is the one who did the initial studies. He was a Bolivian neurophysiologist. He sent us to San Francisco, and they said it was from the left ventricle of the heart, and a person in intense pain was the person whose body this came from. They also found intact white blood cells. Anybody with a medical background here can tell you that 30 minutes after white blood cells are outside of the body, they die. These were living white blood cells 3 years later. Dr. Ricardo Castañón, who is an atheist, converted to Catholicism as a result of this study. Then it was sent to Dr. Frederick Zuderby at Columbia University, the foremost forensic pathologist and cardiologist. When he looked at it, he said he believed that it was taken from a human body less than 30 minutes prior to him looking at it. So his initial reaction was, where's the dead body? Who has been murdered? That was the reaction of this scientist, Dr. Frederick Zuderby. He claimed it was pulsating like a living, beating heart. It was found to be blood type AB. Tixtla in Mexico in 2006. This is the only case in North America. This was the hardest episode to film because this is in the drug-infested area of Mexico. Maybe a lot of areas are, but this was the worst area, I was told. But I prayed to Our Lady of Guadalupe and jumped on a plane and went there with my film crew, and we were stopped so many times with people with machine guns wondering what this gringo was doing in Mexico. And I survived. I ended up with Mexican COVID, but that's another story. But we got all the footage we needed for this episode. And it was truly amazing. And unfortunately, I'm usually pretty good at scheduling things, but the date I picked to film was also the anniversary of the death of 10 people who were shot in Tixtla. And that's the day I decided to show up and do this filming. So it wasn't the best decision, but I lived to tell this story. So this story comes from October 2006. During a retreat mass, a host was effusing a red substance, so the priest preserved it. Here's an up-close photo from the shrine. So they did an extensive diocesan study, and the results were published in 2013. And in fact, the reddish substance was human blood, and it had human DNA and hemoglobin. But for me, the most compelling part of this story is that they said that the blood effused from the inside of the host on a microscopic level, meaning it did not seep in from the outside. It hadn't been wiped on there. It was coming from the center of the host and then going to the outside. And it was found to be blood type AB. Sokółka in Poland. Sokółka and Legnica were two places that I visited 2 years ago, where the most recent Eucharistic miracles in the world are from. In Sokółka in Poland in 2008, at St. Anthony's Parish, a host fell to the ground during Mass. It was placed in the vasco in the water to dissolve. They wondered if it was dirt or a blood clot that was showing up. Here is the shrine inside the church where they displayed that Eucharistic miracle. And I must say, it was so special to travel to all these places, and everybody else is behind the gates. But they opened up the gates for us, and we got to go right up to the Eucharistic miracle. It was truly amazing. Here's a close-up of that host with the red spot. So two specialists in pathological anatomy at the University of Białystok, they did independent tests not knowing the source, and they said it was human cardiac muscle tissue, and it was still alive. And these are top scientists in Poland who are making this claim. They observed that the cardiac tissue was joined to the Eucharist in an inseparable manner, penetrating each other, meaning they didn't know where the flesh ended and the bread began. It was completely interwoven. And the scientists said that there's no known human technology that is known to integrate flesh and there's another substance like a host. And they said it was impossible to recreate. In Legnica in Poland in 2013, just a short distance away from Sokółka, there's another shot of a shrine there. Here is a shot of their display of the Eucharistic miracle. In each of these places, they have a beautiful display for the faithful to see at a distance. Here are some up-close shots that the shrine provided. So the commission began a year later in February. Theologians and scientists examined it. They decided that it was heart tissue of human origin, and this was validated in 2016. The quote is, the Department of Forensic Medicine stated that the histopathological tissue fragments were found containing the fragmented part of the skeletal muscle most similar to heart muscle, with the changes that often are accompanied by the agony of death. Now, as we wrap up the presentation today about Eucharistic miracles, if you were paying attention, you noticed some commonalities. One was the blood group. In each and every case of the Eucharistic miracles that have been examined around the world, and in these 5 cases especially, we have blood group AB in all 5 cases. And you might say, well, isn't AB the most common blood type? No, it's not. It's very rare, except amongst Middle Eastern men. And then we know about the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin has blood on it, the purported burial cloth of Christ. What is the blood type or blood group on the Shroud of Turin? AB. And in all these cases, this comes from heart tissue, from the left ventricle in the heart. All of it. And it's shown to be a person who has gone through distress, like a crucifixion. So we see some commonalities across the board. Now, some medical people amongst us might say, blood group is great. That's amazing that they match. How about DNA? Wouldn't it be amazing if the sample in India, DNA, matched the sample in Italy, matched the sample in Mexico, matched the sample in Argentina? What if they did DNA testing on all these places and compare them? And if they were the same, wouldn't that convert the world? Wouldn't the world have to convert? I think it would. Well, why don't they do that? They have done that. They have done DNA testing on all the Eucharistic miracle samples that I presented. And what did that testing show? Inconclusive. Meaning that they were unable to extract DNA from any of those samples. The scientists in Tixtla who looked at it, independent lab, tried something like 10 different times, 10 different ways to get DNA from this sample. But they got none. They were shocked. And so we might say, what does that mean? Well, we don't know. Maybe God wants to remain mysterious. Maybe God doesn't want to be cloned. Maybe God wants us to bring a little bit of faith to the table. Whatever it is, it sure is interesting. Fresh blood with no DNA. Amazing. And so, as we walk away from this presentation today, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you have after this about Eucharistic miracles or any miracles around the world, we have to try to answer that tough question, why Eucharistic miracles? The Eucharist is the greatest miracle we have in our Catholic Church. On every hour of the day, on Catholic altars all around the world, we have this greatest miracle given to us that many of us ignore, forget about, maybe except for Sundays. Why do we have these Eucharistic miracles, a bonus miracle on top of the miracle? Well, it's my best guess, and I can only say this for myself, but God gives us a miracle like this to boost us, to boost our faith, to help our hardness of hearts. I know that when I go to Mass and a doubt creeps into my mind, I can't help but think back to these scientific studies and say, this is truly amazing. This is inexplicable. And God has given us this extra blessing so that we might approach the Eucharist with reverence, with excitement, and respect. Thank you so much for your kind attention today.